When you hear that song, the one that sounds like it's scratching at the insides of your body, the one that drives fear into your heart, you get transported to the town of Silent Hill. And just as that song is powerful at expressing the series' themes, Silent Hill itself was a master at expressing the sheer powerful nature of psychological and physical horror. In today's video, my very late Halloween special, I'm going to be ranking all 9 Silent Hill games that have graced the PlayStation. Come with me as we journey through 9 games of spine-chilling thrills and goosebump-forming horror. Starting us off in last place is actually the latest game from the series and PS Vita exclusive 2012's Silent Hill Book of Memories. This was a game that showed Konami was trying to give the beloved series a fresh new beginning. They wanted a Silent Hill game that was different every time you played it, and one that involved some kind of multiplayer. So their best idea was to turn one of the most iconic horror games in history into a Diablo-style dungeon crawler with lots of combat and lots of maze-like levels. You start off by creating your own custom character, get a package through the mail containing a strange book that contains all your character's deepest memories, and when trying to alter them you get transported to the maze-like land of Silent Hill. Now that's all about the story that this game has, as from here on out you've got dungeon after dungeon of finding new weapons, busting up monsters and smashing the same few buttons. The levels may be randomly generated, but the process of completing them always stays the same, with talking with Valtiel, fighting through the level's monsters and solving the puzzle at the end. It certainly becomes repetitive, but the combat doesn't really help. Yeah, the combat can be enjoyable, almost like the same enjoyment as an average Dynasty Warriors game. You can equip a large variety of weapons, even Pyramid Head's large knife, but the shallow RPG gameplay will run dry not long after due to the XP giveaway being atrocious in this game. Enemies barely give out any XP, so in order to level up and attempt the later game dungeons, you're going to be doing a ton of grinding, which takes up all the adrenaline out of the pace of the game. Plus there's not a clear way of seeing your weapon stats. You don't get told how much XP you have or how much you are from leveling up. These are basic genre tropes, and to top it off with a small Vita screen, the UI in this game is all over the place. It's not a good looking game, unfortunately. With shoddy execution of a Silent Hill game and dungeon crawler RPG, a lack of variation, simplistic puzzles and zero horror at all, Book of Memories isn't even worth remembering. It's a shame this is how it all ended. Just above Book of Memories and at 8th spot is the first Silent Hill that came to the PlayStation 3, Silent Hill Homecoming. This time we play as ex-soldier Alex Shepard, who is on his way back home from duty. However, his hometown isn't what he once knew, with a fog blocking the views and a lack of civilization. Upon returning to his home, he finds his entranced mother, and she explains Alex's brother Josh and his father have both gone missing. Alex's investigation takes him, of course, to Silent Hill. The narrative starts off gripping, and while it correlates with Silent Hill 2's plot a lot, a man who comes looking for his family member in Silent Hill only to be punished for this and discover the truth behind that person being missing, it does make Homecoming feel a little unoriginal, but for the time, this return to something familiar was what many fans of the series were after. Unfortunately, Silent Hill 2 isn't the only source material that Homecoming pulled from. 2 years prior to this game released the non-canon Silent Hill movie, and Homecoming kind of threads that film's lore in with the lore of this game, thus making it feel like some kind of Frankenstein monster rather than a fun, nostalgic affair. involving the likes of Pyramid Head into this as well, and all the iconography, the symbolism and lore of the previous games feels tarnished. It's almost as if the developers didn't understand what the series meant, what its symbolism meant. It almost feels like one of those AI creates Silent Hill game scenario. The game throws Pyramid Head and the sexualized nurses, which were from James Sunderland's vision of Silent Hill, into Alex Shepard's story because the movie had those monsters. I mean, I love Pyramid Head as an enemy. Maybe his appearance could have been justified if he actually did anything in this game, except he appears purely for fan service. Other enemies here include straitjacket creatures, but this time they emit a smoggy gas substance, human-shaped foes with pendulum-styled head and jaw, they're pretty cool, and also followers of the cult, which now also closely resemble the Order grunts from the Silent Hill movie, thus being the first time we had human enemies in the Silent Hill series. To the game's credit, it had some really unique bosses that symbolized the cult's sacrificed children, one of which was a tall, doll-looking creature that you had to smash apart, revealing the fleshy innards. On the other hand, combat had and hadn't been improved. This time it was a more over-the-shoulder free camera, kind of going that same style as most games of this time, and third-person shooter styled aiming for the ranged weapons, which goes hand in hand with Alex supposedly being a combat veteran. However, melee combat was slow and unresponsive sometimes, and with spammy enemy AI, the atmosphere certainly left the building during combat portions. Homecoming isn't a bad game, but it could have been more refined in places. But even then, this would have still been a very Americanized game, with it feeling distant from the rest of the series due to how much it didn't understand the lore and iconography of what made Silent Hill so powerful in the first place. At 7th place is the latest mainline entry of the series, 2012's Silent Hill Downpour, and was another game that Konami threw the license to a small, unknown European developer with no experience in horror games. You play as a convict, Murphy Pendleton. Whilst being moved to prison, the bus carrying Murphy crashes on the shore of Silent Hill. Downpour is the most open world of all the Silent Hill games, letting you freely roam and explore the vast town, and also having many side quests littering the dilapidated buildings. It also changed up the other world, this time making them into these big rusty set pieces where the walls of the normal world crack away and underneath the geometry twists and changes, and often it'll have you being chased by a deadly black hole of sorts. In the town, the other world will have it rain heavy, which also spawns plenty of enemies. And while all this is a cool addition, it does end up taking away from the more visceral and gut-wrenching terror of the past game's otherworld sections. The enemy design here I definitely say is the least creative, most enemies looking like Resident Evil monster knockoffs, and then this game's Pyramid Head, the Boogeyman, isn't the most creative, just being a large gas mask wearing dude with a hammer. Despite this, Downpour has a ton of combat, and that's down to just how much this game likes to respawn enemies over and over. If you want to run away from them like you could do in the past games, they will either grab you from half a mile away, or they'll chase you down until they eventually get you anyway, so you're best just fighting them. Except combat isn't that much improved over Homecoming, with again it being slow and oftentimes unresponsive. It did however add to the puzzles and exploration though, through the use of a new UV mode on your flashlight. Downpour at the very least had a fun story, that instead of trying to inject unneeded fanfiction about Pyramid Head or involving plot points from non-canon movies, stayed its own complete narrative, and while it's commendable all the innovations it tried to bring to the table, it just didn't have the money or the talent or the time to see it through. With bland graphics, unresponsive combat, banal world design, and poor performance on PlayStation 3, Downpour is a close but sad misfire for the series. Our entry at number 6 is Silent Hill Origins. This is available on the PSP and PlayStation 2, and was the first in the series to not be developed by the original creators Team Silent, and instead Konami shifted development to British studio Climax. As the name would suggest, Origins is a prequel to the first game. You play as Travis Grady, a truck driver who passes through the town to shorten his travel. However, after seeing a young girl on the road, he gets out of his truck to investigate. He finds a house on fire and inside a young girl who has been scorched by flames, but he manages to get her body out of the house before it collapses. Outside, Travis falls to the ground and passes out, and when he awakes, he's in the fog-choked lands of Silent Hill. Origins certainly feels like the closest to the original game's vision out of all the Western developed games, but it also interjected new ideas. Origins introduced an innovative mechanic of being able to manually travel between the real world and other world, and both versions may have different changes like the object to a puzzle you need or a locked door is now open. Having both versions included in the level design also meant it didn't stress the PSP's limitations. Origins, however, did have a heavier focus on melee combat. Now all weapons had deterioration meters and could break only after short usage. You could now pick up mini TV sets, coat hangers, and even use your fists to bust up some monsters. But this kind of broke the horror atmosphere more times than I would have liked, smashing through creatures like your Rocky Balboa. The creature design saw a lot of enemies returning from past games, like the straitjacket monsters and the nurses. It also has some interesting new designs like Carrion, which were mangled looking dogs, sort of looked like they'd been hit by a large vehicle, Travis being a truck driver and all. This was a nice callback to how Silent Hill monsters reflected personalities and traits in the protagonist. There's also the game's recognisable butcher enemy that took a lot of inspiration from Silent Hill 2's Pyramid Head. Unfortunately, the game's story of Travis feels disconnected and unrelated to the origins of Silent Hill playing out in the background, with Alessa and the cult of Silent Hill 1. Travis feels like the random guy in the street is just running around the town trying to find his purpose, and while that sounds like a fun idea for a game's plot-ish, it isn't the game's plot. It focuses too much on setting up the events of Silent Hill 1 and not enough on Travis's role here in the story. Silent Hill Origins' uninspired world, themes and monsters and ideas, its harsh weapon degradation system, and an unfocused story that the first game told well enough already are all what hold this one back. Our number 5 started out as a project named Room 302 as Team Silent wanted to change the series up, but it eventually got reworked into Silent Hill 4, because you know the name will sell it more copies, I guess. You play as Henry Townshead, who's living outside of Silent Hill in his 302 apartment. After a few recurring nightmares, Henry wakes up one day to find he can't leave his apartment. The doors and windows are chained, no neighbours can hear his cries for help, and there's no reception. However, Henry finds a large tunnel inside his bathroom. Hearing voices coming from within it, Henry decides to investigate. This is how you'll get to Silent Hill, and your apartment will act as a safe room you'll come back to throughout the game. These sections in your apartment were very unique for the time, allowing you to take a breather, heal, save your game, and manage your inventory before stepping back into the nightmare, all whilst well conveying that fear of claustrophobia. Each time you return to your room, Henry had what is called hauntings, in which the windows start shaking, or the TV turns on, or blood starts pouring out of the walls. And as the game goes on, it gets worse and worse. This mechanic was later built upon in PT, and would have been expanded upon further if Silent Hills hadn't have been cancelled. But while Silent Hill 4 made many innovations and stepped in a new direction, it was unfortunately held back from the quality of its 3 predecessors. Starting with its inventory was changed to it now popping up during gameplay instead of having to go into a menu, making it a real-time inventory, and struggling to use a health kit at the end of your inventory bar whilst getting slashed at by an enemy just isn't fun. An inventory in a pause menu, in a horror game at least, It gives you time to collect your thoughts and strategize. A real-time one makes the gameplay much more twitchy, which works against the slow combat mechanics of the series. Also, the enemies in 4 start off uncreative, with your standard zombified dogs and even hostile wheelchairs. Later you get screaming monkeys and burping nurses. Although there are some really creative and frightening enemies, the rest end up more laughable and boring, distant from the enemies in the first 3 games. 4 also suffers from a lot more backtracking than usual, less environmental detail and lighting, a painfully forgettable protagonist with poor voice acting, and very little to no emotion or personality. Regardless, this was the final game in the series, developed by Team Silent, and the projects after this game that we've covered certainly lacked their vision. At number 4 is Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which was the last game in the series for the PlayStation 2 and PSP. It is a creative interpretation or reimagining of the original Silent Hill story, and technically not canon in the main narrative. However, this doesn't stop it from being one of the most imaginative games in the series. The game will begin as the first game does, with Harry Mason crashing in Silent Hill and looking for his daughter Cheryl. However, this time around, it's not a story about a cult or demons, but instead a psychological drama about discovering the truth. It's a really engrossing plot in finding Cheryl. I won't spoil everything because I seriously feel everyone should experience this themselves, even if you just watch a YouTube video of the game's story. But as the plot deepens, you'll discover that Harry's memory of Cheryl isn't the most clear, such as discovering where he and Cheryl lived has actually been occupied by a different family for more than 40 years. It's a story that keeps you hooked all the way through, and you should definitely experience. In terms of gameplay, this is where Shattered Memories is the most out of place in the series. The gameplay is basically split into 2 parts. Like previous games, you have the real world segments and the other world segments. Now, the real world parts in Shattered Memories have very little gameplay, as no enemies spawn and you're kind of just left to explore the environments, taking it all in. Now, the other world was majorly changed, from its metal and blood symbolism to just a cold and frozen version of the town. The other world sections are now the only parts that spawn enemies, but the game has no combat, and thus you're pressured to run through the otherworld levels, dodging foes and getting to the end of the maze-like design. In between gameplay and story portions, you'll spend time in the office of your therapist, who asks you questions and make you solve certain tasks, and in doing so the game will build your psychological profile in the background. It's very much like the similar sections in Until Dawn. Each time you visit your therapist, your profile will build in multiple different areas. Which areas get which points will depend on some of your actions in the game, such as if you look at nude mannequins or stare at empty alcohol bottles, and your stats will also increase depending on your answers to your tests you are given from your therapist. The tests have things like matching photographs to make couples, or dividing pictures between what seems sexual or non-sexual in your opinion. The great thing about this is it gives you slight insights to how a psychoanalysis would work, but also the fact that there are no right or wrong answers, it's all your own interpretation. Now, the answers you give and the way that you play, your psychological profile will change events in the game, change characters' attitudes towards you, change certain characters' costumes, but most importantly decide which ending you'll get. And this was Shattered Memories' strongest innovation, which later horror games have actually began to adopt, like the aforementioned Until Dawn and even some of the Dark Pictures anthology games. Shattered Memories sure isn't as strong as the first 3, but I really felt it an underrated gem in this series of pretty samey and trope-laden horror games. This one actually tried to break the mold, and while it does have a lack of engaging gameplay, it makes up for this with great graphics and lighting, fun psychoanalysis systems, and an engrossing plot. Kicking off our number 3 is the original Silent Hill. This was created as Konami's answer to Capcom's Resident Evil, but instead of zombies and lab creatures, Silent Hill was based around paranormal entities and a fear of the unknown. Harry Mason and his daughter are driving through the titular town when they swerve and crash and Harry's daughter goes missing. For the PlayStation 1, this was a well-paced and multiple ending story with memorable characters and plot points. The whole story isn't hand-fed, instead you got to explore and uncover the town's secrets yourself, each person's interpretation therefore being unique. Silent Hill itself was open and roamable to explore and find keys and items, and this larger town-based level design definitely helped in differentiating Silent Hill from other horror games of the time. Silent Hill was also rendered in full 3D, unlike Capcom's Resident Evil, which superimposed its polygonal characters over pre-rendered backgrounds. This allowed the fixed camera to move around the 3D environment, creating some really strong emotions, like as if you were being followed. It added to the uncomfortable feeling that the game well evoked. Sound design carried that rusty paranormal tension with it, and still to this day has a completely unique feel due to its abstract use of tools and items to create music, such as one tune using a dentist's drill, which many may have a strong fear of. This creativity waved into the animation details also, things like how Harry pants after a long run, or how he holds his hands up if he runs into a wall. Very good stuff for the PlayStation 1. This game has really smooth animations, however the tank controls are disorientating and really rough. Combat also is aged and slow and can be a real struggle to battle against fast moving foes. The original Silent Hill most certainly hasn't aged the best. It has some outdated level design, like the sewer level. It has some outdated combat. However, this doesn't take much away from the gut-wrenching atmosphere that Team Silent created. Without a doubt, one of the most chilling PS1 games you can play. Silent Hill is where it all began. As a quick heads up, the second and first spots on this list, these next two games really could go either way. Both are near perfection for PlayStation 2 horror. But at second spot for me is the first Silent Hill game that I had experienced, Silent Hill 2. Having no connection to the original game, you play as James Sunderland, who is looking for his presumed dead wife at Silent Hill due to a letter he got sent from her asking for him to return to their special place. Easily the strongest part of Silent Hill 2 is its fantastic narrative, which has many twists and turns. Silent Hill is no longer a town twisted by the thoughts of a lesser, but it instead attracts those with dark secrets and turns their nightmares into reality. Silent Hill 2 also doesn't hold back. This is a very mature narrative that delves into mental illness and sexual abuse, but it's not distasteful, but rather thought-provoking. The game has a strong side cast like Maria, James's wife's doppelganger, who taunts him throughout the game. I've always found that Silent Hill 2 has one of the best openings of a horror game. It begins with an incredible sequence only involving running through the woods down to Silent Hill. You meet no threat, however, with the music playing in the background, the thick fog feeling like it's trying to choke you, and the lack of people or even wildlife in general, it built a chilling atmosphere that warned you were headed far away from civilization. Silent Hill 2 introduced the monster Pyramid Head, one of the most iconic creatures in all of video game history. It also had the straitjacket looking creatures and sexualized zombified nurses, and the monsters in this game depicted aspects of James' shattered personality. This game was much stronger in environmental detail and had more realised character models and fantastic real-time lighting. It was one of the best looking PS2 games in its day. Team Silent knew exactly what worked with the first game and improved upon that. They managed to make one of the most frightening games of all time, but through atmosphere, tension, design and sound acting in unison.
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real.
The only entry that in my opinion can hold a candle to Silent Hill 2 is the number one on this list, Silent Hill 3. If you've not noticed yet, every mainline Silent Hill game puts you in the shoes of always similar characters, middle-aged, straight white males. And while James and Harry are some great protagonists for this series, Heather Mason, the first and only protagonist to break this mould, really brings a completely new angle to this franchise, and it's such a departure, such a unique look, that it completely sells it for me. Heather is a very relatable young woman, and most importantly, she's likeable. If she wasn't, the atmosphere would have been ruined, but that's not the case here. With her journey into Silent Hill comes all the horrors of being a young adult, the effects of puberty and pregnancy and loss. It's another strong, mature story, but unlike the ones seen in the other games. The characters are what makes Silent Hill 3 so strong, well written personalities and great voice performances. Douglas, the detective, is a very honourable side character who helps Heather by putting himself in harm's way and asks nothing from it. He's here because it's all he has left. There's more demonic and hellish iconography this time around, and 3 has a great array of locations you'll visit throughout the story, places that resonate with younger people, such as a shopping mall and the iconic Silent Hill 3 amusement park. Silent Hill 3 also has the best graphics in the whole series. The character models, the lighting, the visual details were so stunning for the time that Team Silent refused the use of pre-rendered cutscenes and made everything in-engine. That's how proud of their work they was, and still to this very day, this PlayStation 2 game looks so good. And who could forget, this game has some awesome unlockables such as a lightsaber and laser beams as extras. Silent Hill 3 is without a doubt my favourite game in the series due to how much it broke ground, went with a new perspective, but still stuck by what the series meant. It didn't force non-canon movies into its story or try to become a multiplayer dungeon crawler. 3 is such a big achievement and one of the greatest horror games on the PlayStation 2. Overall, Silent Hill is one of the most iconic video game franchises, and it's down to the first 3 games made by Team Silent. The rest of the games are a bit all over the place, trying to do so many things, all whilst ripping stuff from the originals just to keep the name. Shattered Memories is the only one that actually went in a different direction and stuck by it, which is why it is one of the more unique Western-made Silent Hill games. With recent rumours that Silent Hill could be getting some type of reappearance, I hope it allows the series to have at least one last big, terrifying triumph.